Okay, now I asked you here to talk about Venezuela, and now we're almost an hour in, but I still want to get some of this in because I have been having all these arguments, debates, whatever you want to call them, on rising about immigration policy. Conservatives obviously feel like this is an issue that is strong for them. It seems like the Zaza Zoo has gone out of wokeness. They're not getting as much juice out of that particular bet noir. So they've moved on. And there is a real, I would describe it as a humanitarian crisis and not just a kind of crisis at the border, with increasing in large numbers of immigrants. And it does seem to me that there's this conversation that excludes a discussion of root causes, except for Kamala Harris, who just likes to say the words root causes over and over again without actually describing what they are. And it does seem to me that there is, not seem to me, evidence suggests, research indicates that there is a pretty strong relationship between sanctions implemented during the Trump administration and the influx of immigrants, specifically from Venezuela. And I want to, first of all, start by characterizing those sanctions, because we talk about sanctions, but I want to talk about what those really are, what effect they have, and what the rationale was initially for putting them in place.
Yes. Well, it's a good question, and it's an important question. And, the roots of it actually go back to the Obama administration in 2015, where he placed this very sort of technical this very technical thing out there, which is trying to remember it correctly, an unusual and extraordinary threat. Venezuela represented an unusual and extraordinary threat, which then opens up the ability to use different sort of scaling sort of sanctions things. It's in a way, if I take one step back, when you think about sanctions for the United States, one thing that I think a lot of people don't know is there are a lot of kind of just sort of standing sanctions that if you're listed as this thing, if you're on this list, then all of a sudden restrictions can be put on you. So a lot of it is kind of technical in that way. So I say all that to say that Obama puts on this designation, unusual and extraordinary threat, which then opens up the toolbox of what's possible that the Trump administration really puts forward. And so the sanctions exist on a few different levels, but they mainly are things that restrict specific activities, for instance. So they restrict American companies from doing certain trade with the oil industry, importing oil from Venezuela. And of course, historically, the oil industry in Venezuela is very closely linked, directly linked to the United States. Many of the equipment and so on and so forth, these are coming from American companies and so on and so forth. So to basically enact a de facto blockade that isn't just about importing oil, but it's also about preventing, say, oil field services companies from servicing the oil fields, which means they can't have any oil. And this is their main export, the main way they make money, which is the main way they support many of the social programs that were able to reduce poverty from 44% to 27% from 1999 to 2013, right? So there are sanctions that exist in that realm around sort of specific economic activities. Then there's another range of sanctions that exist on about 150 individuals. These are what are known as the so-called targeted sanctions. Well, they're not that targeted, but they basically say that these individuals, no one really can deal with them from an American company, from the American government, and even companies and governments in other countries can then be held responsible and sanctioned themselves, secondary sanctions it's called, for dealing with these individuals. Now, since it's aimed at individuals, I think a lot of times people will say, oh, well, I guess it's not that big of a deal. But I think part of what takes place is the individuals that get named are officials that are, involved in a lot of the business. For instance, going to buy food abroad. A number of officials who've been involved in going to buy food abroad for Venezuela to bring it back to the country to be distributed at very low cost through community-based programs have been sanctioned. So if they fly to a country to try to buy food, people are like, hey, I'm not going to work with you. I don't want America dealing with my business. And you have that as well. Then you have the third set of things that are happening, which are basically attempts to disrupt the Venezuelan economy through, sort of, I don't even really know exactly what to call them, maybe sequestering their assets. So you have the seizure of Citgo, the gas company that people know, which was for many years founded and owned by PDVSA, which is the state oil company of Venezuela. That was seized in a really basically illegal operation when the U.S. recognized this fake President Juan Guaido, and they're trying to break it apart. But that, more income that you lose. There is a lot of gold, billions of dollars in gold held in the Bank of England that England said, well, we've now recognized Guaido, so you can't have this, your own money to use on whatever you want to use. And so there've been different ways to sort of turn various Venezuelan assets that were also able to contribute to the general coffers of the government that have also been blocked. So you have this kind of panoply of different things that are out there, but they all really boil down to making it very difficult for Venezuela to do business on many different levels abroad, and to make it difficult for them to use their existing assets outside of Venezuela in order to generate income from the country, to be able to go out to buy food, to buy medicine, to industrialize the country, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of a capsule view of how the sanctions work.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And when you're thinking about the impact, it is important to recognize. I mean, we had the sense of it in Cuba. You know, when you think of Cuba and old cars and old appliances and old everything, it helps, I think, to conceptualize what it means to not be able to import goods. When you really think about what any given country would look like if it was only reliant on what it can make in-house, as it were, and that this impacts Venezuela's ability to even sell oil even outside of the limit on being able to import American oil. It tends to import light oil to mix for export purposes.
Mm-hmm.
That's quashed. Ability to get replacement parts for a lot of the refineries, that's quashed. And then I think your point about how various kinds of oil for food efforts, humanitarian efforts, were also quashed by these sanctions, I think are all really important points. I mean, I went back and was looking at some of the coverage at the time, and I saw this clip of Donald Trump standing in the UN General Assembly saying really point blank that these sanctions were necessary to punish Venezuela for socialism.
Yeah.
That this was about socialism.
Currently, we are witnessing a human tragedy, as an example, in Venezuela. More than 2 million people have fled the anguish inflicted by the socialist Maduro regime and its Cuban sponsors. Not long ago, Venezuela was one of the richest countries on earth. Today, socialism has bankrupted the oil-rich nation and driven its people into abject poverty. Virtually everywhere socialism or communism has been tried, it has produced suffering, corruption, and decay. Socialism's thirst for power leads to expansion, incursion, and oppression. All nations of the world should resist socialism and the misery that it brings to everyone. In that spirit, we ask the nations gathered here to join us in calling for the restoration of democracy in Venezuela. Today, we are announcing additional sanctions against the repressive regime, targeting Maduro's inner circle and close advisors.
And that is a subtext to, I think, part of the right-wing narrative right now, why they really like particularly focusing on Venezuelan immigrants, because they can do a double duty of, see, this is what socialism has wrought. And now they're all here. And also we shouldn't be responsible for their choice to do with socialism. I want you to unpack how much socialism is to blame for the migration crisis.
Well, I'd have to say I wouldn't blame it at all, because if you look at the vast majority of Venezuela's time as a socialist country, what you see is, again, significant reductions in poverty, the expansion of access to healthcare, the expansion of access to Venezuela. I've been to Venezuela a number of times from 2005 until 2022, and you can see the impact is palpable. I mean, the 5 million houses that have been built, distributed for low cost, sometimes no cost, in a country where housing was in a complete crisis, where, of course, I already mentioned the issue of poverty reduction, but I think it's, important to note that 99 to 2013, a reduction of 44% to 27% of poverty, that's very significant in the context of any country, I think, but certainly from the point of view of this country that for many years had been touted as, this great wealthy country in all of Latin America, but 80% of the population is living in abject poverty. They tried to, they did actually do a lot to reverse that, to bring in, significant changes in the country. I mean, it's hard to even explain if you haven't seen it in and of itself. But in areas where there was no access to healthcare whatsoever for multiple generations, there's now, health clinics for tens of thousands of people who would have no opportunity to work in anything other than the informal sector. They're able to now become doctors and nurses and to work in their own community. I once sat in a class of elderly people in a adult technological literacy class that was 100% free. And they were all basically grandmothers who had never used a computer before. And they felt they weren't even able to interact with the world in the way they should, not able to communicate with the younger members of their family as well. And here they were being taught how to use technology, which they could then use for free in computer labs that were being set up all across the various low-income neighborhoods there in Caracas, in the area where I was. So I think when you look at the reality of what is taking place inside of Venezuela, the primary engine of the economy that was able to drive the various social changes that exist in the country was completely and totally crippled by the United States. So I don't think that you can really address what's happening there as socialism being to blame. And the one thing I'll just say really quickly that also is never mentioned is, honestly, no matter what you hear in the media, the deepening of democracy that has existed in this time. I mean, not only just in terms of elections in and of itself, but in terms of community, participatory, grassroots democracy. Most people don't know that last year, just over 1 million people were elected to be spokespeople for their community in elections where many people voted, primarily in poor areas and in rural communities, to have someone who was empowered by the people themselves to be able to speak directly to government officials, interface with them, other elected officials, and represent them on a day-to-day basis. And all of these various small projects and large projects that are happening in Venezuela are a result of the fact that under President Chavez, they started to move the country in a direction of Bolivarian socialism, as they call it, socialism of the 21st century, that I think has done things that people around the world rightfully admire. So to me, I would not say the economic crisis is related to socialism whatsoever. And quite frankly, I would say in many ways, the lack of transformation in certain areas of the economy that are still heavily controlled by capitalist companies, many of which very close to the United States, is also part of the problem and why the economic issues that they have there now.
Yeah. So just to really put a fine point on the connection between the sanctions specifically and the migration crisis, the study that was done by Francisco Rodriguez that I saw him on Democracy Now! And he was making some good points, so I looked it up. He says the sanctions resulted in an income decline of about 26%, which is equivalent to a Great Depression. The effect on the life expectancy of Venezuelans has been equivalent to the life expectancy dip due to COVID. Speaking of COVID, an inability to import the drugs necessary or the PPE or whatever that are necessary for COVID relief also dramatically impacted their ability to respond to the crisis. GOP is down 72% per capita. And so 96% of the country's foreign currency reserve was coming from the oil industry, which of course has been substantially crushed because of these targeted sanctions. So here we are. I think that is indisputable. What I am curious about, though, is given your description of the increase in democracy in the country, how we did get from a Chavez place to a Maduro place. And, feel free also to get into the Juan Guaido of it all and America's role in trying to prop up that alternative kind of Obama-esque figure to Maduro, the way that America tends to do in picking and choosing foreign leaders that are convenient to them.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important question. Chavez becomes the president in 1998. He was a very known figure in Venezuela because he is a longtime critic of the existing society that was deeply unequal. Inflation was out of control. Corruption was out of control. He actually led, sort of an armed uprising. He was a military officer of military officers in the early 1990s to try to overturn, one of these very corrupt governments. He then goes to jail at that time, but he becomes kind of a folk hero in that process for taking this bold move. Ultimately, throughout the 90s, he's doing various things. So he's elected as president in 1998, and he continues to be president till 2012 when he tragically dies of cancer. And ultimately, over that time, a lot of transitions happened under Chavez. I mean, he was trying to, first of all, try to move the country more away from just a strictly oil economy. He was trying to establish, a lot of grassroots structures that in Venezuela they call communes, where, individuals, sometimes in the neighborhood level, sometimes a lot larger, sometimes it's a handful of people, sometimes it's many thousands, start to govern their own territory themselves in sort of a new type of grassroots, as they call it, participatory democracy, and as well as massively expand social programs. So you have these huge transformations happening in the country at the time. And one element of that transformation is not just the empowerment of, the poor in general, but I think also the empowerment of the poor in a sort of racialized sense as well, because Venezuela is a country that has been deeply afflicted by racism. I would say the majority of people are, probably some sort of mix of indigenous and African, but there is a very white elite that tended to be very associated with the wealth that was extracted from the oil industry. And Chavez started to undermine that as well, even his own visage and who he was. And a lot of the hatred towards him was always extremely racialized, that he was this sort of Black indigenous person. So, I mean, and you can think of changes in the sense of the specific policies, but I also think you have to think of changes in terms of the culture of the country and the differences that were being brought in terms of how, the hierarchies of control. But all that being said, Chavez does get cancer. He passes away in 2012. And Nicolas Maduro, who has a very long history, started out as a bus driver. He was a well-known trade unionist. He was a leader in other socialist parties. He had worked with Chavez for many years. So he had his own long history. He becomes the candidate who was, Chavez said the best candidate, and then he is able to become the candidate of the ruling party, if you will, of Venezuela, and to carry the election forward in 2013 against a guy named Enrique Capriles. Now, this is kind of random, but it'll get to the Guaido thing here. I'm not just giving it just to give it. So anyway, that was a hotly contested election. I was actually there the week before the election. It was unclear who was going to win. And Capriles was a very popular mayor in many ways. He was the most popular opposition guy, very telegenic, photogenic. A lot of people thought he was going to win. Who is this guy Maduro? People hadn't really heard of him, whatever. Anyway, he does not win. Maduro becomes the president. So in that moment, and this is 2013, this election happens, the opposition in Venezuela really starts to switch their strategy. And they thought at one point they could maybe challenge Chavismo at the ballot box, because in 2002, they tried to launch a coup against Chavez that failed. So they then moved to this electoral strategy. So they thought they could challenge them. They couldn't challenge them. So then they really start a aggressive attempt to try to find ways to undermine the country, from different, big companies doing essentially capital strikes to very disruptive protests. In one case, this is later on in 2017, there's a man who was burned alive because he was perceived to be a Chavista, and he was perceived to be because he was Black, which again gives you a sense of who the opposition is. So in the midst of all of this, there is an attempt to try to use the unrest that's being created by the right wing to undermine the legitimacy of the government by having this guy Guaido essentially declare himself president of the country with the backing of some legislators in the country. So there was no election, there was no anything like that. It was just like the opposition grouping of people who just decided that, they tried to use a loophole essentially, or what they claim was a loophole in the Constitution, to say that this group of legislators could nominate him to be the president. It's very kind of Byzantine, but ultimately he had no mandate whatsoever. There was no sort of election, no sort of popular thing. He just declared himself the president of the country. And then immediately all of these powerful countries, the US, the UK, the collection of countries, it's the European Union, they all recognize him as the leader. And so then, because you have powerful countries recognizing you, it creates this challenge where then you have not really two rival governments in the country. I think it is very well recognized in the country that Guaido did not have big support. When he would try to mobilize support, he couldn't come close to what the Chavistas could mobilize in terms of the street. I mean, not even close, just nothing like it. But nevertheless, in the international arena, you still have the ability to then use the courts, to use international pressure, to start to put into place some of these abilities to say, take away things like Sitco, impound the gold in the Bank of England, and so on and so forth, which then further destabilize the country, which then they use as Guaido and his friends use as an even greater platform to say, look how terrible these people are. They failed the country. They're just ruling the country. And if you bring us in, we're going to change everything. But ultimately, that does not work. Because it's just not representative. The opposition at this point is now turned on Guaido. He is no longer really, I think he actually still claims he's the self-declared president, but most of the other opposition leaders don't recognize him. Some of the opposition leaders now are actually in negotiations with the government and want to participate in elections that will probably happen next year. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's more or less the timeline of how we got there. Is Guaido emerges from a strategy of chaos and tension created by the opposition that sort of convinced the Western powers that it might be possible to sort of, through smoke and mirrors, created an alternative that could potentially take power through pure attrition and wearing people down by destroying the economy and presenting this guy as an alternative.
We also today call on the Venezuelan military and security forces to accept the peaceful, democratic, and constitutional transfer of power. I call on all responsible nations to recognize interim President Guaido immediately. Maduro has made clear he will not recognize Guaido or call for new elections. Now is the time to stand for democracy and prosperity in Venezuela.
Ambassador Bolton, if I could, you mentioned the word significant response. How do you define significant response?
Well, we're not going to define it because we want the Venezuelan security forces to know how strongly we think that President Guaido, the National Assembly, the opposition, and most importantly, American personnel are not harmed. This is an unequivocal statement on our part.
Is there any circumstance under which American forces would get involved?
Look, the President has made it very clear on this matter that all options are on the table.
So the narrative that we got in the United States from the mainstream press during all of this was Maduro bad, Juan Guaido good, young, telegenic, described as Obama-esque in some of these contexts. Maduro dictator, bad, fascist, and socialist somehow. And you had as you described, the global community playing into this in not just rhetorical ways, but really substantive ways, preventing them from being able to access $1 billion in gold reserves. Of course, the sanctions mean that they can't access US dollars and trade on the marketplace for all of the things that aren't being made internally. They can't export. We've gone through all of that. What is the truth there? Because I have heard people say, well, the left is defending the bad practices of Maduro by criticizing the kind of soft coup attempt of the Western world trying to replace him. What do you make of how the left has characterized? Well, I mean, how should we be thinking about Maduro? You know, my enemy's enemy is my friend. I mean, what kind of a leader, in fact, is he? And is it possible to raise potential concerns about what's going on without validating Western empire?
Well, I guess it depends on what concerns. I would say that, but I think in the abstract, sure, yeah, it's always possible to raise a critique and a criticism. And I would say inside of Chavismo, even though this, of course, not covered in the mainstream media, there's quite a bit of discussion actually around and critique of what the government can do, what it should be doing, how it's relating to the market, how it is or is not empowering grassroots structures, how that process in and of itself should move forward, and so on and so forth. There's much more of, I think, a dialogue than most people are even aware of inside of the camp of people who would all consider themselves Chavistas and all consider themselves supporters of Maduro. So that discourse is certainly there. I would say in terms of what sort of leader he is, I think, the easiest way to look at that in many ways is to see that he's been able to gain the support of the majority of people in a number of elections who turned out to vote, that he has the backing of millions of people. I mean, if you look at what's been happening over the past month, it's hard to find, unfortunately, in the Western media. It's actually been pretty amazing over the past 2 months. All across the country, there have been huge demonstrations of tens and hundreds of thousands of people backing the overall government and the leadership of Maduro as what needs to happen or what needs to be there to take the country forward. And I think some of that speaks to many of the things he's done. There are critiques in Chavismo, for instance, about corruption, and that there is entrenched corruption inside of the country, and that people felt like, we think Maduro has some of the right ideas and the other leaders, but all these people in between, they're blocking us and they can't stop it. And he actually recognized that, spoke to it, called it out, and using technology established a new system where people can basically communicate directly with his office about what all these different problems are. Some of them he actually airs them out on his television show that he has, but then it allows him from the top to be able to go in, and if there is somebody who's doing something corrupt, say, okay, this is the problem, this is the issue. It's called the 1 in 10 system. 1 like it looks like 1 times 10, the 1 in 10 system that allows them to actually break through some of that. So, I mean, I think some of that speaks to what kind of leader he is and what he wants to do, and why someone like Chavez would say, this is the person I think can best carry out the spirit of what we've been trying to do here since 1998 in transforming our country, making it more participatory, more protagonist, and yes, socialist. So I think Maduro, like basically every other socialist leader that does anything good, is heavily demonized in the West, because the only way to prevent people from seeing they're doing good things is to just make people turn off their brains and lose their curiosity, to the extent when you hear the name, you assume it's evil, bad, dictator, this,
Yeah,
that,
I mean, I got to say, I was interviewing a Hill reporter this morning talking about the new news, which is that Biden is going to keep building Donald Trump's wall. You alluded to the fact that there were a number of Congress members who very specifically would never get on board with the plan to lift sanctions, even as some of those Congress members are the same ones that are inveighing against the volume of migrants specifically from Venezuela.
Right. That is odd, and it is a difficult position to justify. But the truth is that, I mean, the Venezuelan regime is basically everything they accuse it of. It's not that sort of cartoonish idea that they don't like it because it's leftist, or they don't like it, for whatever political reason. The Venezuelan regime is repressive, has destroyed the country's economy, has basically kicked out 8 million people out of their own country. 8 million people didn't leave because they had a bad feeling about socialism. They left because conditions really are dire. Same thing for Haiti, different circumstances, but people are leaving Haiti.
But do our sanctions not contribute to those conditions? I mean, this is the question. If you feel the desire, if you feel it's our kind of political or moral obligation, and I don't agree with this, but let's just for the sake of argument, if you feel it's our political or moral obligation to punish a regime that we in America just happen not to like, putting aside all of the bloviating we do about democracy and people being allowed to run their countries how they want, if you believe America has the right to sanction and limit the primary domestic output of a country like Venezuela, its oil output, because we don't like its leadership, then don't you consequently have a responsibility to deal with the migrants that leave because of your foreign policy decisions? And how are these legislators able to take both the position that we should be encouraging the crisis, exacerbating the crisis via sanctions, and turning away people who are leaving because of our own behavior?
Well, there are some legislators, especially Democrats, who won't, who won't appease the Venezuelan regime, and at the same time are saying we need to bolster our asylum process. That, I mean, in that sense, that would work within your argument.
And the politics of that, and who is going to like this, that will also support Biden. Who is he trying to appeal to? Isn't he just losing support of his own base? The hypocrisy of the Democratic Party on display as the wall became a symbol of all the bigotry of the Trump era. And now apparently Joe Biden wants to take that on. But anyway, we were talking about this and I was like, well, why aren't sanctions a bigger piece of the conversation? Why is Biden not doing the much less controversial thing, at least in terms of our kind of social justice-y context on the left, of talking about easing sanctions as opposed to building this wall? And the guest, Rafael Bernal, basically said that part of the trade-off is that if you lift some of the sanctions, then Maduro is going to use the money that he's able to now get to buy weapons and be repressive to his own people. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I'm hearing.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that's the discourse. I think it's totally false. I mean,
yeah.
First and foremost, I mean, Venezuela already has one of the most capable militaries in Latin America, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And, all you have to do is look at, they just had a big police operation in the south of the country to take on this kind of, I don't even really know what to call it, prison mafia, I guess, that they had like a zoo in this prison and all these other things. So, I mean, they sent 11,000 people there to, break this up. So they obviously have a lot of sort of military force and things like that. So the idea that somehow if they got more money, they would be like buying more weapons as if now the sanctions are preventing them from doing so. But I guess I would also say, I don't think they're using those weapons to repress people. But even if I was to accept that premise, it obviously is just not the case in terms of what's actually happening in the country. And I would say you really also have to look at the fact that what have they actually been mainly spending their money on? I mean, again, 5 million houses that they're building for people, the mass expansion of healthcare and education that exists inside of the country, the attempt to try to empower different industries so they don't just have to rely only on oil, the attempt to also not just empower industries in general, but things that are run in cooperative and communal fashion so that the economic aspect of it isn't just accruing to a small number of people. I mean, that's what the majority of money is being spent on and has been spent on in the Chavista period. It's not that they haven't improved their military, because they certainly have, because they're concerned about, the US and for a long time Colombia, but most of the money has not been spent on building up the military. It's been built up on social programs. And when you look at the things that have been hit the most by the collapse of the oil industry, it's exactly the social programs that, I don't know your guess, so I can't speak to it, but I think this is when I hear that narrative, the hypocrisy, because you can see programs like CLAP, which are community-based programs to distribute low-cost food to the poorest people so that they can have some basic food security. I mean, that's one of the number one things that's affected by the sanctions, and they're spending huge sums of money to bring this food in from abroad because all of it they can't grow there in Venezuela. If you don't have that, then people, of course, are going to go hungry.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.